The Browning M2, the 50 caliber machine gun, entered World War II with a reputation for reliability. It had served in various forms since 1921. It was proven, heavy, dependable. But the version mounted in American bombers, particularly the flexible turret installations, was not the same weapon that ground forces trusted. It was modified for aircraft use, fed from different angles, operated remotely or by hand in cramped turrets, and in those configurations, over Europe and the Pacific, it jammed. Not occasionally, not under rare conditions. Consistently, gunners reported it, pilots noted it in debriefing reports. Maintenance crews worked on it between missions. The problem was not isolated to one bomber type or one theater. It was widespread, and it eroded confidence in a weapon that was supposed to be the primary defense against enemy fighters. This was not a matter of poor training or inadequate maintenance. This was a mechanical failure embedded in the way the weapon was adapted for airborne use. The Browning M2 was belt-fed, recoil-operated, and air-cooled. Its cyclic rate was approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute, slower than lighter guns, but each round carried significantly more energy. The 50 caliber projectile could damage engines, penetrate armor, and destroy control surfaces. In theory, a bomber bristling with multiple M2s could create overlapping fields of fire that would deter or destroy attacking fighters. The Army Air Forces believed this. They installed the weapon in waist positions, tail turrets, dorsal turrets, and chin turrets. B-10s carried up to 13. The 50 caliber guns, B-24s, carried 10. The assumption was that volume of fire and hitting power would protect the formation. The weapon's design was sound on the ground. It had been tested extensively in fixed mounts and on vehicles. But aircraft installations introduced variables that testing had not fully accounted for. The gun had to operate in temperatures ranging from desert heat on the ground to -40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. It had to function while subjected to vibration, rapid altitude changes, and airflow that could exceed 200 miles per hour in open waist positions. The ammunition feed had to work regardless of the aircraft's orientation, climbing, diving, banking, and it had to do all of this while being operated by gunners wearing bulky flight suits and oxygen masks, often under fire, with limited visibility and restricted movement. Modifications were made. The weapon was fitted with lighter barrels to reduce weight. The feed mechanism was adjusted to accommodate flexible ammunition belts that could twist and bend as the turret rotated. The headspace, the gap between the bolt face and the barrel, had to be set precisely, and this setting could shift due to vibration or temperature changes. These were not minor adjustments. They were alterations to a weapon that had been optimized for different conditions. Army Air Forces ordnance officers believed the modifications were sufficient. They believed the weapon would perform. Initial testing supported this belief, but initial testing did not replicate combat. Bomber crews trained in the United States under conditions that bore little resemblance to what they would encounter over enemy territory. Training flights were conducted at moderate altitudes. Ammunition was loaded carefully by ground crews. Guns were inspected before and after each flight. Malfunctions, when they occurred, were addressed immediately. There was time, there were resources, there were spare parts. The environment was controlled. The training syllabus assumed that the weapon, if properly maintained, would function reliably. Gunners were taught to clear jams, but the training emphasized prevention through maintenance, not rapid clearing under combat stress. Combat missions over Europe required bombers to operate at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. At those altitudes, temperatures were extreme. Lubricants thickened or froze. Metal contracted. Ammunition that had been loaded hours earlier, sometimes the night before, was subjected to temperature swings that affected primer sensitivity and powder burn rates. Gunners wore heavy gloves. Their fingers were numb. They operated the guns while scanning for fighters, monitoring oxygen flow, and communicating over intercom systems that were often unreliable. The guns were not fired in short, controlled bursts, as in training. They were fired in sustained engagements that could last several minutes as fighters made repeated passes. The flexible mounts introduced additional complexity. In a waist position, the gunner had to swing the weapon through wide arcs, feeding ammunition from a belt that twisted and flexed. In a turret, the gun had to track targets while the turret itself rotated and elevated. The ammunition feed had to keep pace. If the belt twisted too sharply, if a round was slightly out of alignment, if the feed pawls did not engage properly, the weapon stopped. And once it stopped, clearing the jam in a cramp, freezing, vibrating space while under fire was not a matter of following a training checklist. It was a struggle against mechanical resistance, limited space, and the knowledge that every second the gun was silent. The bomber was vulnerable. The first large-scale raids over Germany in 1943 revealed the extent of the problem. 8th Air Force bombers encountered aggressive fighter opposition. Luftwaffe pilots attacked from head on, from below, from above. They pressed attacks to close range. Bomber gunners opened fire, and the guns jammed. Not all of them, not every time, but enough. Debriefing reports from missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen included repeated references to gun malfunctions. Specific bombers reported multiple guns out of action during the same mission. Gunners described rounds failing to feed, bolts failing to return to battery, cases failing to extract. In some instances, the jam could be cleared. In others, the gun remained inoperable for the rest of the mission. Maintenance crews examined the weapons after missions. They found carbon fouling in the chamber. They found broken extractors. They found feed mechanisms that had been damaged by improperly seated rounds. They found headspace settings that had shifted. Each failure had a specific cause, but the pattern was undeniable. The weapon, as configured and maintained in combat conditions, was not reliable. Ordnance officers initiated investigations. They reviewed maintenance procedures. They examined ammunition quality. They tested lubricants. They found contributing factors, but no single root cause that could be easily corrected. The failure was not mechanical in the way a broken part is mechanical. It was systemic. The weapon required precise adjustment. It required clean ammunition. It required consistent lubrication that remained effective across a wide temperature range. It required feed belts that did not bind or twist. It required operators who could diagnose and clear malfunctions quickly. Combat conditions provided none of these consistently. Ammunition was exposed to moisture, dust, and temperature extremes. Lubricants were applied in the relative warmth of the ground, then subjected to freezing temperatures at altitude. Feed belts were handled by gunners wearing gloves, who could not feel whether a round was properly seated. Adjustments made on the ground did not hold at altitude. The weapon was being asked to function in an environment it had not been designed for, with tolerances it could not maintain. The core issue was headspace. The gap between the bolt face and the barrel had to be set within a few thousandths of an inch. Too tight, and the cartridge would not chamber. Too loose, and the cartridge case would rupture upon firing, jamming the action. Headspace was adjusted using a gauge and a combination of barrel and bolt components. On the ground, this was straightforward. But in flight, metal contracted as temperature dropped. A headspace setting that was correct at 60 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground could be incorrect at -40 degrees at altitude. The contraction was small, but the tolerance was smaller. A setting that was marginally acceptable became a jam waiting to happen. Ammunition feed was the second critical failure point. The belt had to present each round to the feed mechanism at the correct angle. In a fixed mount, the belt fed from a consistent position. In a flexible mount, the belt fed from a position that changed constantly as the gun moved. If the belt twisted, if a round canted even slightly, the feed pawls could not engage. The round would not enter the chamber. The bolt would cycle without chambering a round. The gun would stop. Clearing this required the gunner to manually remove the belt, inspect the rounds, and reload. In a turret, this meant removing the ammunition can, inspecting the belt outside the turret, and reloading while the aircraft maneuvered and other gunners continued firing. It was not always possible. Sometimes the gun remained silent for the rest of the mission. Extraction failures were the third major problem. After firing, the bolt had to extract the spent case and eject it. The extractor was a small metal claw that hooked the rim of the case. If carbon fouled the chamber, if the case expanded more than usual due to excessive pressure, if the extractor itself was worn or damaged, the case would not extract. It would remain in the chamber. The next round could not be chambered. The gun was jammed. Clearing this required removing the barrel, manually extracting the stuck case, and reassembling the weapon. In combat, this was impossible. The gun was out of action. Testing had not exposed these failures because test conditions were too forgiving. Test ammunition was clean, properly stored, and loaded immediately before firing. Test guns were adjusted and inspected by armorers. Test firings were conducted in controlled bursts with pauses to allow the weapon to cool. There was no simulation of a sustained engagement at altitude with ammunition that had been loaded hours earlier and subjected to temperature extremes. There was no simulation of a gunner trying to clear a jam while wearing gloves and an oxygen mask and being thrown against the turret wall by evasive maneuvers. Testing validated that the weapon could fire. It did not validate that it could fight. Gunners learned not to rely on the weapon absolutely. They learned to carry extra ammunition belts. They learned to inspect rounds before loading. They learned to check headspace before missions, even though it would change at altitude. They learned to fire in shorter bursts to reduce the chance of overheating and jamming. These were adaptations, not solutions. Some gunners became proficient at clearing jams quickly. Others could not. The result was inconsistent defensive firepower. A bomber might have 10 guns, but only 6 or 7 would be operational during an engagement. Commanders could not predict which guns would fail or when. They could only accept that some would. Pilots and bombardiers were aware of the problem. They heard the gunners reporting jams over the intercom. They saw tracers from their own formation and noticed gaps where guns should have been firing. Some pilots began flying tighter formations, relying on mutual defense rather than individual firepower. This was a tacit acknowledgement that the guns were not dependable. It was not discussed in those terms. It was framed as tactical adjustment. But the underlying reason was loss of confidence in the weapon. At command level, the problem was recognized but not easily solved. Ordnance officers issued new maintenance directives. They mandated more frequent inspections. They changed lubricants. They tested different ammunition lots. They experimented with modified feed mechanisms. Some improvements were made. Failure rates decreased slightly, but the fundamental issues, temperature sensitivity, feed mechanism complexity, and the precision required for reliable operation, remained. The weapon could not be redesigned and remanufactured quickly enough to matter for the majority of the war, so it remained in service with its flaws acknowledged but not corrected. By 1944, some bomber groups had developed their own maintenance protocols. Armorers would adjust headspace for expected altitude. They would hand-select ammunition rounds, discarding any that showed signs of damage or corrosion. They would fire the guns on the ground before missions, knowing that this did not guarantee function at altitude, but believing it reduced the chance of failure. These were local solutions, not official doctrine. They were never formalized. They varied from unit to unit. Some groups achieved better reliability. Others did not. The weapon remained a variable, not a constant. In the Pacific, the problem was less severe, though still present. Missions were often flown at lower altitudes, where temperatures were less extreme. Engagements with Japanese fighters were sometimes shorter and less intense than those over Europe. But even there, gun jams were reported. Even there, crews learned to expect that some guns would fail. The weapon's reputation was no longer one of reliability. It was one of conditional function. It worked, most of the time, if conditions were right. But conditions were rarely right. Late war modifications included improved extractors and revised feed mechanisms. Some bombers received upgraded weapons with better cold weather performance, but these changes came too late for most crews. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. The M2 remained in service, but its wartime performance in bomber turrets was not celebrated. It was quietly acknowledged as a limitation that had been managed, not overcome. The Browning M2, the .50 caliber machine gun, did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was adapted for a role that exceeded the tolerances it required to function reliably. The weapon needed precision that combat conditions did not allow. It needed maintenance that could not be performed in flight. It needed environmental stability that did not exist at 25,000 feet over Germany. The gap between what the weapon required and what combat provided was never fully closed. Crews adapted. Commanders adjusted tactics. The weapon remained in service because there was no alternative, not because it met expectations. The M-2's legacy on the ground was one of dependability. Its legacy in bomber turrets was one of persistent, unresolved failure.